when I got to the state hospital, they don't let students have access to psychiatric populations. They don't let researchers have access to psychiatric populations. In all the years and all the decades I've been working in psychiatric facilities, I have never, ever seen any researcher in there. Not in the prison, not in the psych hospitals, not in the private hospitals, nowhere, you know,
And
ever.
you worked in the biggest hospital, I think, in America, if not the world, in the biggest psychiatric
Yeah,
hospital.
there were close to 10,000 patients there when I first got there.
And you
You
never
know,
saw anybody in there researching?
nope,
Whoa.
never, never. You
Whoa.
know, matter of fact, I was the only one that started. Because I was looking for answers, and one thing that was odd is, I'd ask everybody what causes schizophrenia. What is it? I'd ask psychiatrists, I ask psych nurses, I'd ask uh, any doctor that I saw. Only a small handful of them said we don't know. Those were the honest ones. The vast majority said it was a chemical imbalance in their brains.
Well, hello everybody, and I'm here today with a great guy called Jerry Marzinsky, BA, and he's got a master's in education. Jerry is a retired licensed psychotherapist with over 35 years of experience working with and studying the thought processes of psychotic and criminally insane patients in some of the most volatile psychiatric institutions in the nation. He has held the positions of Second Lieutenant Arizona Civil Air Patrol and Assistant Scout Master. His formal academic training comprises a BA in psychology from Temple University, a master's degree in counseling from the University of Georgia, and 2 years of study in a PhD psychology program. He is the author of an amazing journey into the psychotic mind, breaking the spell of the ivory tower, which I only finished a few days ago, and is a fantastic book. So Jerry, welcome, and it's great having you here. Can you tell us what you think about psychiatry today? What is your opinion about psychiatry?
Oh, holy cow! Uh, it's not a good one. I think it's probably one of the biggest scams ever perpetuated on the public. Those medications that they're using don't cure anything. You know, nothing. All they do is suppress psychiatric symptoms. That's it. Um, you know, they, this started long ago when the Rothschilds and those big multimillionaires back in, I think it was, around the 1930s, where they came up with the Flexner report, where they paid off Congress to make it a law that any medical institution, university, that didn't teach pharmacological material, like medicine based around pills, you know, or drugs, would not be allowed to graduate doctors. So they took over the whole medical establishment from that point on. Now, psychiatry was struggling with neurology, back at the turn of the century, and was losing ground badly. So back in the late 1800s, a dye lab in France accidentally discovered phenothiazines, which is the basic ingredient in antipsychotics. So that the lab workers in that dye lab would start getting gorked out and tired and showing symptoms of being drugged up. One of their pharmacology companies saw this and got the active ingredient out of whatever dye they were using. They wanted to try to use it on psych patients in France, but they weren't allowed, because at that time the psychoanalysts had control of things. So they brought it to the United States to a psychiatric institution here, and they found that they could completely drug up an entire population of mentally ill people, and they didn't cause any problems. They were gorked out. They were, just walking around in Lulu land. That was wonderful for them. They kept all these people under control. They could reduce staff. They didn't need, there weren't as many battles, because prior to that they had to wrestle these people into straitjackets, and that was always a battle, and both the staff and patients would get hurt. Here they could just drug them up, and they'd walk around in a dazed state, not causing any trouble. So that was wonderful. The psychiatrist just jumped on it. So for the first 10 years after that stuff came out, they had absolutely no idea why it worked. They just knew it did work. Another psychiatrist there was one psychiatrist. That's when these prefrontal lobotomies came up too, back in, I think it was the early 1930s. They would stick an ice pick through the person's eye up and then scramble their prefrontal cortex, just tear it to pieces. That stopped violent patients from acting out. So, and it turned them into zombies. I mean, I met one when I was working at the state hospital, and I remember after talking to him, I was thinking, this guy just isn't quite human, and I knew what they had done to him, but the way he came across was very different from a normal person. There was one guy in a lobotomy mobile. I think it was back in the 30s. He was driving all over the United States and doing these lobotomies. So, here's psychiatry doing all this crazy stuff, to start with, trying to figure out how to treat these schizophrenia. They tried ice baths, they tried hanging these people from ropes until they were exhausted. Then they started feeding them the medics to make them sick and throw up. And when you throw up, when you get sick, you don't feel like causing trouble. So, they started with the medics to make them sick. Then they started with insulin shocks. And then they started with electroshocks. When they found that a monkey that was electroshocked in a lab that was thrown feces would calm down for a while. So, they were doing all these horrendous things. And then they moved to shock treatments, where they put electrodes on the patient's brain and just zap them with, a massive electric current. And I watched one of those once at the state hospital when I was working there back in the late 70s, early 80s. I still remember it. They brought in this frail old lady. I mean, two nurses, this frail old lady. I mean, she'd done this before. I could see they'd done it before. And they strapped her down, with these 4-point straps. I mean, they had straps all over her body, so she couldn't move. And here's a psychiatrist giving us I was working there at the time, but there was a bunch of psychiatric students there who were watching this also. So me and a friend of mine jumped, we jumped in and we were watching. And I asked him, I said, why all the straps? Why are you strapping her down so tight? He said, well, if we didn't do that, the shock would cause her to react so violently she would break her bones. So I'm like, whoa, a therapy that breaks bones. So then next thing he did was got a big horse needle. I mean, the thing was big. The barrel was about that big and it was about that long. It was filled with this white milky fluid. And so he put that in there, and I asked him, well, what is that? He said, it's a muscle relaxer. And I said, well, what's that for? He said, to relax them so they won't struggle so hard against the straps, because if we didn't give them that, they would break bones trying. And I'm like, well, this is getting more and more bizarre, And so here he is lecturing, and then he showed these electrodes. They were about this big square metal plates attached to these wires. Here's this box with these dials on it. And he put gel on the inside of the electrodes. And I said, well, what's that for? He said, well, if we didn't put that on there, it would burn their skin when we give them the shock. So I'm thinking, they're using so much voltage that it's going to burn the person's skin. You know, so they strap those things on there, and they, the guy, he stuck the muscle relaxant in her arm, and he didn't just squeeze it in. He pulled the plunger back and forth, mixed it with blood, and then he slowly injected it. So I'm sitting there watching that, going, oh, and then he finally gets all set up, everything's ready, and he tells everybody, stand away from the gurney, because he's going to give this person the shock. And we all got away. He pushed the button, and that poor lady, she just convulsed. It looked like something in Frankenstein's lab. I mean, she was just jerking and thrashing all over the place, and those straps looked like they were barely holding her down. And this just went on for like an eternity, it seemed like. And then finally he turned the freaking thing off. And I was kind of in shock. And then he starts lecturing all these students. He was like this immense ego. I mean, he was enjoying all the attention he was getting from all these students. And I'm looking at this poor old lady, and she's turning cyanotic. She's turning dark blue. And I'm like, hey, doctor, look at your patient. I mean, she's dying. And he goes, oh, almost like an afterthought. And he grabs these paddles that you give shocks with on the heart. And he put that on her. He gave her another shock, and she jumped. And then her color started coming back. And it was like, I got a pretty strong stomach. But after that, I was just stunned. I was just absolutely stunned. And I almost fainted. After we're walking out, I had to latch onto a column to keep from collapsing. And I knew that they used these shock treatments. They were given 3,000 of them a year at the state hospital where I was working. 3,000. And I knew that most of the time they were used for punishment for patients who were acting out. And they weren't recommended by the doctor, who seldom spent a lot of time with these patients. They were recommended to be given by the doctor by attendants on the psych ward. So if these attendants were having a hard time with a particular patient, they would say, hey, we need, we think Joey needs another shock treatment. He'd interview the guy, and then he'd be scheduled for one of those shock treatments. A neurologist saw that there was brain damage even after a single shock like that. Now, what I did see is it drove away schizophrenic symptoms for a day or two, maybe a few days. It helped with depression for a short period of time, but all that stuff eventually came back. So it wasn't doing any long-term good, and it was used a lot for punishment. They use it today with lesser voltages, and it does seem
they still use it today.
Still in use today, but not with the same amount of voltage. So it's still there.
Wow.
So here's my introduction to psychiatry. The next thing I saw was, when I got to the state hospital, they don't let students have access to psychiatric populations. They don't let researchers have access to psychiatric populations. In all the years and all the decades I've been working in psychiatric facilities, I have never, ever seen any researcher in there. Not in the prison, not in the psych hospitals, not in the private hospitals, nowhere.
And you worked in the biggest hospital, I think, in America, if not the world, in the biggest psychiatric hospital.
Yeah, there were close to 10,000 patients there when I first got there.
And you never saw anybody in there researching?
Nope.
Wow.
Never.
Wow.
Matter of fact, I was the only one that started, because I was looking for answers. And one thing that was odd is, I'd ask everybody, what causes schizophrenia? What is it? I'd ask psychiatrists, I ask psych nurses, I'd ask any doctor that I saw. Only a small handful of them said, we don't know. Those were the honest ones. The vast majority said it was a chemical imbalance in their brains. You know? And that's what I was taught in graduate school also, the chemical imbalance in the brain. One thing I saw, though, that I found odd was that if there's a chemical imbalance of the brain, before you treat it, it would seem that you would need to have a baseline. What chemicals are out of balance and by how much? You know, and the brain has what, 23 or something like that neurotransmitters. Which ones are out of whack by how much? So I was watching what psychiatrists do time after time after time. And I worked with a number of different psychiatrists. I never saw a single one of them give any lab work at all to determine, what was out of balance in the patient's brain or by how much, ever. So I found that curious. I mean, how do they know what to do if they don't have a baseline from which to take off on? So I asked one of the psychiatrists, I said, what's the deal here? I never see you guys give any kind of lab work or any kind of test or anything to determine what chemicals are out of balance in the brain of these people before you start dishing out drugs. And he said, oh, the drug companies take care of that. We don't worry about it. We just administer the drugs. And I'm thinking, that's like letting the fox in the hen house, letting the drug companies determine a chemical imbalance. What are you thinking? But that's what they were doing.
It's like the DSM-5 that labels almost all human emotions as mental illnesses.
Right. That's what they did. They took the whole gamut of human emotion, broke it up, and pathologized all these segments of it. That's their Bible. That's what they taught us in graduate school, and in the PhD program. It was even worse. It was like, this is the Bible. You will memorize great parts of it, so you can diagnose people. I found out later that it was completely fabricated. It's all made up. There's not a single test for any of those mental illnesses. There's not a single lab test. There's no EEG, EKG. There is no test to verify even a single one of those diagnoses in the psychiatric Bible. Not one. They were all made up by psychiatry. Now, the psychiatrist who made that up, they get together once every few years. I found out that 2/3 of them were under the influence of big pharma. So they, and I heard one psychiatrist describe it as like a tobacco auction, where one of the psychiatrists will come in and go, hey, I think I got a new psychiatric illness here. It's these are the symptoms and blah blah blah, and he presents what he thinks it is, and they all vote on it. So they vote these mental illnesses into that Bible, and they vote them out. So at a point, they had mental retardation was considered a mental illness. There was a bunch of flack about it. They took it out. Now they just put in, I think, transsexual dysphoria disorder. So they're just adding these things, and then the drug companies come along behind there, and they come up with some kind of drug that they say treats it. So it's just a big freaking scam. So these people, they have these codes there too. The codes are specifically for billing, to bill the insurance company. So they have this fancy looking diagnosis. They have all these descriptions of it. They have this psychiatric code for it, and they use it for billing. So that the whole system is one big freaking scam. It's people, especially I watch this especially with schizophrenics and bipolars. They go off their meds because the side effects are horrendous. They're awful. They're just terrible. So they only can deal with them for a certain amount of time. Then they go off and they get psychotic. They go back into the hospital. They're hospitalized until their insurance runs out. Their insurance runs out. They release them. They fill them full of drugs again and say, take your drugs. And release them either to the family or the mental health center or wherever they go. And that goes on again, and then they stop taking their drugs again. It's a big merry-go-round that just goes round and round and round and round. Nothing is being cured. Nothing is being solved. None of these drugs are doing anything except gorking these guys out. They're basically tranquilizers that just turn these people into semi-zombies.
Can you talk about some of the assaults upon psychiatrists that some of these patients do? For example, even outside or assaults upon people when they're on these drugs.
Well, when they're on the drugs, uh, usually they're sedated. Now, what I saw when I first got to the psychiatric hospital, I mean, there was no cell phones back then. There was no internet back then, back in the 70s. So the 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 hospital cafeteria, which was a big cafeteria. I mean, we had thousands of staff there. You know, we'd all get together because at Milledgeville, where Central State wasn't in the middle of nowhere. You know, there wasn't even a McDonald's in the town at the time. You know? So we all ate at the food factory, and we ate this basically the same food they fed to the patients. It was probably upgraded a little bit, so the staff didn't complain a lot about it. It was very inexpensive and very convenient. So that's where the staff would meet, and that was like the grapevine. You know, anything that happened in the hospital, it would be echoed in there. And I remember hearing, you know, from all these different units, these people who worked at the different psychiatric units. You know, there were over 200 buildings at that place. It was the size of a small city, and we'd all meet there for lunch, and people would say what was happening in their unit, and there was just this noticeable uh, in, uh, level of assault on psychiatrists. And that didn't make any sense to me, because when I watched what the psychiatrists were doing in the units where I was working, they would spend 15, 20 minutes with a patient, maybe once every 2 weeks or once a month, and that was it. And I'm thinking, like, what are they doing to piss these patients off in 15 or 20 minutes, where they're being assaulted at this horrendous rate? They were being assaulted more than regular doctors, than psych nurses, than psychologists or counselors or anybody else. You know, they were hitting the psychiatrists. And I'm like, what is going on with this? Um, and I didn't know for years. It took me 7 years to get an answer to that one. But it turned out that these symptoms, that these awful symptoms that these drugs were causing, you know, dry mouth, memory impairment, uh, you know, being turned into a zombie, akinesia, nervous tics. I mean, all these horrible. I mean, there's like a page full of horrible side effects that these drugs produce. Um, well, the voices that these patients were hearing, the schizophrenic patients, were telling patients that the psychiatrist is poisoning you. So the assault rate on psychiatrists was equal to that of attendant staff who were with these patients 24 hours a day. So, you know, those drugs are toxic. Those antipsychotic drugs are toxic. With long-term use, they do damage to the central nervous system. They found that after they were doing autopsies on psych patients who'd been on these drugs for a long time, that their brains had shrunk like walnuts. And they published that, and of course the psychiatric mafia and big pharma went nuts. Oh, no, it's not our drugs. It's not our drugs. It's the schizophrenia that's doing this. You know, which they
When,
didn't even know what it was.
when did
You
they
know,
publish that paper about
oh
the
shoot,
shrinkage?
I don't know.
Oh, okay, okay.
You can look it up.
Yeah, sure, sure.
You know, brain shrinkage in schizophrenics. It was a good while ago. It I would say, you know, it wasn't available when I was working at the state hospital. It wasn't there.
You said that at the very beginning, you were challenging the physical cause of schizophrenia by asking, like, what are thoughts? That you said that you went into psychiatry because you wanted to know what thoughts were.
No, I didn't go
So,
into psychiatry. I went into psychology.
psychology, excuse me, psychology,
There's a
excuse me,
big
excuse me,
difference
excuse me, excuse me. So, can you elaborate on that?
on the thoughts.
Yeah, why you went in, like, for example, at the beginning of your career, and now you're still challenging the physical causes of schizophrenia, the sickness, like how is it developed?
Well, you know, I went in, I think, like most people who go into psychology, to try to figure themselves out.
Right,
You
okay.
know, and You know, after 4 years of undergraduate psychology, I got very few answers. You know, there was experimental psychology where you could actually see what was going on. I mean, you could go into one of their labs and actually watch the process go on. You know, but in psychology itself, you had to trust whatever these people were saying. You know, they would not. You couldn't get access to a clinical population. You know, to see if what they were saying was true. There was no way to check it out. So here they are teaching this entire 4-year course with all these psychology books, especially in the clinical areas, where you could not check it out. You had to believe what they were saying. You know, and if it sounded odd, um, tough beans. You had no way to check it out. You could not get into a psych hospital. You could not get into a prison where psychiatric patients were or prisoners were kept. You could not get into a mental health center and talk to patients. You couldn't. You know, so it's like, oh, we are the experts. This is what we say. So, you know, I memorized all their stuff. I jumped through their hoops, and then when I got to um, Central State, you know, I remember one time reading an abnormal psychology book where this one clinical psychologist wrote a paper. We were assigned this paper that said if two crazy people had the same delusion and got together, you know, one of them would have to give up that delusion and take on another one. And even as an undergraduate, I'm thinking, what's with that? Why would that have to happen? I mean, they're both, you know, crazy. Why would one have to switch? So, you know, didn't make any sense to me. So I kind of threw it in the back of my head and said, well, maybe one day I'll be able to check this out. And it was probably 4, 5, 6, probably 7 or 8 years later, I was able to check it out. So I was working at the state hospital at that time. I was doing rounds. Went up to the second floor of the psychiatric unit, and I saw this one patient. Now I've noticed this before with the schizophrenics, because what all they teach in these psych classes is that the voices schizophrenics hear are hallucinations. You know, they call them auditory and visual hallucinations. So you think of a hallucination, you think of just random stuff, you know, that doesn't make any sense. It's just all over the place. You know, word salad. It just doesn't make any sense. It makes no logical sense. So I'm watching these patients carrying on conversations with somebody I couldn't see. And it wasn't just one, and they weren't word salad. It wasn't just random words and babbling. Or they were carrying on a coherent conversation with something as if they were talking on a telephone and you could only hear one side of the conversation. You know, so I found that odd. I'm like, what is going on there? You know, and it wasn't just one, it was a bunch of them. So one day I was making rounds. I took the stairwell up to the second floor of this big psych unit. I was in the day room, and I saw this patient I didn't recognize, you know, walking across the floor, carrying on a conversation with somebody, you know. So I kind of crept up on him to see if I could hear what he was saying. And it was a coherent conversation. He was giving coherent answers. It wasn't word salad. It wasn't just random words. These were complete sentences he was talking to whatever it was with. So I'm like, what? You know, I was expecting garbage. No, it wasn't garbage at all. So, you know, I kind of worked closer to him, and I was trying to listen to what he was saying when he spotted me. And he turns around and you know, I say, well, I'm Jerry. I'm the psych for this unit. I haven't seen you before. I said, are you new to this unit? And he goes, yeah. I said, well, what's your name? And he says, I'm Jesus Christ. And I went, oh. And you know, I thought of that paper, and I said, no, you can't be Jesus Christ because I am. And I was hoping nobody heard me. And I'm standing there like sitting on pins and needles, like, okay, what's he going to do? You know, and he cocks his eyes back and he's thinking, and then he finally makes a decision. He looks me in the eye and he goes, okay, we can both be Jesus Christ. And then he strums away. And I went, what else did they lie to me about? That was enough to set off red lights in my head. So this chemical imbalance thing was the next thing that came up. Oh yeah, it's a chemical imbalance, but there is no baseline. We're not taking any labs. We're not doing any kind of measurements to see what is out of balance by how much. I later found out that there is no test for that. They don't exist. They don't exist. They're they just don't exist. They made this up. The
So
drug
today,
companies, the
there
drug
is,
companies, they
Mhm.
made this up back in the 70s with Prozac.
So there
You know,
is no natural explanation for schizophrenia. No,
oh,
no,
well, there's there's an explanation for it, but it's not a physical thing.
right,
It's
okay.
not a disease. It's not a physical process. It's a spiritual process. It's
So
driven by the voices, which
what
these
are
people say are hallucinations.
what are the voices in your opinion? What are these voices?
They are entities. They have varying levels of uh, intelligence. Um, they they are inserted into the patient's mind and all our minds. It's not just the patient's. They come from outside. They're inserted into the patient's thought stream. Okay, and they sound just like the patient's internal dialogue. In most cases, there's no difference between the thousands of thoughts that we have in a day and how they sound as compared to how one of these insertions sound. Okay, and we all have them. You could be you know walking around outside or something, and all of a sudden you get this thought, hey, knock that guy in the head ahead of you with your fist, or uh, if you're standing on the bridge and something comes into your head, say, hey, why don't you just jump? Or driving your car. Why don't you drive into the oncoming traffic? What would that be like? You know, why don't you punch your wife or something? These thoughts that come in that are different from your intent. All right. So these are energetic entities. There is no space. There is no time. There is no matter where they exist. So they exist in an energy universe, as John Mace would say. They're not physical. You can't see them. You can't measure them. Uh, they're like thoughts. Nobody's ever found a thought in anybody's head. Nobody's ever dissected the brain and found a thought. They're very low frequency entities. They can smell uh, negative emotion like a shark can smell blood. So they're attracted to people that vibrate at a low frequency. Very depressed people, um, very negative people, very evil people. uh, They're attracted to. Another thing that's very strange is that they can go into your mind and they can pull up every negative thing that you've ever done, and they can throw it into your thought stream and say, hey, what about this? you know just kind of a memory of these bad incidents that you've had time after time after time. And what I found is that what happens is that the patient's energy level, once these things attack, their energy level drops, you know and it's consistent. Now the schizophrenics themselves don't notice that unless you point it out. And a lot of them, if you ask them, well, you didn't use that energy, where did it go? And most of them will say, well, I don't know. If you make some of them think about it, they'll go, well, the voices took it, because there's a one-to-one correspondence between the voices attacking and their energy level being drained. I've had some prisoners tell me that they could actually feel their energy being drained while these voices were attacking them.
So communicate. Okay, so why are schizophrenics more susceptible to these voices than, let's say, you or me or an ordinary person? Even though we hear the same voices to a certain extent, or to a lesser extent, excuse me.
Much lesser extent.
So what makes the schizophrenic more susceptible than an
Well,
ordinary?
that's fairly simple. It's intense physical, psychological, sexual abuse, you know, or any other kind of mass trauma. You know, and meth, and to a different extent, cocaine. What do you call it? The stuff they snort, um, crack. Cocaine opens up the spiritual energy field like nothing I've ever seen. I remember when prisoners who had been using meth started appearing in the prison. Uh, and they were psychotic as anybody else. They were psychotic as the regular psych patients. And talking to them, it all originated from the time they were using amphetamine. And the way it proceeded was, they'd get high, they'd feel great like Supermen, they'd have tons of energy, they'd be able to travel at 1,000 miles an hour forever until they collapsed. And after a certain period of time, they'd start hearing voices. And they would go, oh, those are just hallucinations. They'll disappear when I come down. And they did for a while. So it might have been weeks or months, where they'd use the amphetamine, and then they'd hear these voices. And then when they came down, the voices would disappear. And then one day they didn't. And they were there permanently, and they would not leave, and they were stuck with.
So is there a spiritual cure for this? For example, Emanuel Swedenborg. Who was Emanuel Swedenborg, and what was his ideas about this? Did he have
Well, yeah, he was a Christian mystic that lived, I believe, some 700 years ago, and he he was very interesting. Um, he's the one that keyed off myself and a clinical psychologist who I was associating with at the time, who worked at a state hospital in Northern California. Okay,
Wilson Van Dusen?
Wilson Van Dusen. So he wrote, The Presence of Other Worlds. So he was able to, what he noticed was that the voices that schizophrenics heard matched the descriptions that Manuel Swedenborg gave of. Now Swedenborg was given access to heaven and hell, so he could go into a trance, or he would go into a trance for 3 days at a time, and he would travel through heaven and he would travel through hell, and he would talk to the spirits there. So Van Dusen was reading about his travels and his conversations with spirits in hell, and he was curious about the voices that schizophrenics were hearing also, and he was trying to make friends with those voices to learn as much as he could about them. He found that the descriptions that Van Dusen gave of those spirits in hell matched exactly what he was hearing from his schizophrenic patients.
Whoa.
And he wrote about it. And when I met him, I had the same experience. I had the same experiences. So when I had some pretty traumatic experiences working with these things, poking in psychotics heads. See, for years, I mean, for decades, I thought they were. First, I thought they were hallucinations, and then when that didn't play out, I was going, well, they must be some broken aspect of their subconscious or something like that. But more and more evidence was showing up that these things were independent entities, and I didn't want to believe it. So I was in denial for decades, and well past the point where there was plenty of evidence that these things were not hallucinations. They were not anything subconscious, but I wasn't quite sure what they were. So I started experimenting, and most of the experimentation I did was in the prison, because when I was working at the state hospital, when I was caught twice by psychiatrists who found out I was asking patients about what their voices were saying to them. Like, what is it? What are they saying? What are they talking about? And nobody else was interested. They all believed they were hallucinations. So if you believe you know the answer to something, you won't be looking for another answer. Now, that's what was taught in the medical schools. That's what was taught in the universities. That's what everybody was brainwashed to believing. that the voices were hallucinations, you know. But when I saw these people talking in coherent sentences, that didn't match hallucinations. You know, it's like these are these were full sentences. They were coherent sentences. They had meaning. They were directed toward somebody that I couldn't see or something I couldn't see. It didn't seem to match the description of a hallucination. Right. So I started studying these voices, and I found that they started to run patterns. The more I looked at them, the more patterns they ran. And you know, one of the first patterns I understood was that they were totally negative. They were abusive. They were destructive. They were insulting. They were derogatory. It was never anything good. Okay. So, you know, as I was finding this stuff, like I said, I got pulled up in front of two different psychiatrists and told the voices are hallucinations. You know, by asking questions of the patients about what they are, you're just reinforcing those hallucinations and you're making the patients worse. You know, and I was ordered to stop. You know, so I had to be very careful from then on. I had to be under the radar. I couldn't talk to anybody about what I was doing. But you know, I did the patients I trusted, the patients who had it somewhat together that were doing good. I would still question them. And one of the first patterns I saw was that these uh, voices were consistently awfully negative. You know, what held them on such a negative path? Why didn't they go random? Why weren't they positive sometimes, neutral sometimes, and negative sometimes? Why weren't they all over the place? What force was holding them onto a totally negative trajectory? I found that very odd. And anybody who works with schizophrenics can see this for themselves. Just start asking them what the voices say. You'll see for yourself they're totally, absolutely negative. You know, they're derogatory, they're insulting, they 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 uh, they're attacking the patient consistently. They're not good things. Okay? The second pattern I found was that they were anti-religious. You know, they didn't want the patient going to church. They didn't want them going to chapel. They didn't want them talking to preachers. And in the psychiatric rehab center where I worked, the preacher every once in a while would do an ice cream social for the patients there. And what I found odd was all the other patients on the ward that I was in charge of um, would go down to this ice cream social where there was cake and ice cream, except for the schizophrenics. They would stay in their beds and stare at the walls. And I noticed this time after time after time. And uh, one day I walked the ward and the ice cream social going on downstairs, and here are these guys laying in their beds alone in their unit, staring at the ceiling or the walls. And I asked them, well, why aren't you down there, you know, with the preacher uh, having cake and ice cream? I mean, that's hard to come by in this place. And they go, we don't want to deal with the preacher. You know, the Bible's a bunch of junk. There is no God. Uh, you know, that kind of stuff. They were completely anti-religious, and so were the voices. They didn't want the patients reading the Bible. They didn't want, and I had a number of patients tell me that when they repeated the 23rd Psalm, the voices would react like worms thrown on a hot frying pan.
Whoa.
I found that odd. You know, the Lord's Prayer, they did the same thing. They didn't like them reading the Bible. They didn't like them going to church. They didn't like them doing anything that was spiritual. And so I started questioning the patients who did go to church. And I found out they broke into three different classes depending on how strong the voices were. So the voices are of various strengths. Some of them are extremely strong and have a lot of control. Others don't have so much. I mean, there were like three different classes. I found out if the voices were weak, when the patient showed up at church, the voices would usually disappear. You know, they just be gone. If they were of moderate strength, they would get louder when they were in the church. You know, and when the preacher started speaking, they would get louder to try to block out what the preacher was saying. You know, it made it hard for the patient to concentrate on what was going on, what was being said. If they were very strong, they would actually get the person to stand up and actually bolt out of the church. They would just virtually run out of the church or walk very quickly. Just get up and get out. Uh, I found that odd. You know.
Hmm. Is there any difference between, as you said, most of the time the voices are negative, but is there a difference between like spirits? I know in your book you have a chapter titled Bad Spirits and Good Spirits. So how do you categorize that in terms of voices? I think you wrote the higher order of spirits commonly communicates through feelings and intuition,
Right.
whereas they don't use words, whereas the negative spirits use words or
Yeah.
something like
Yeah. The
that.
negative spirits, and these voices are spirits. You know, they're negative energetic entities. Now the positive spirits, I found that they won't speak most of the time unless the person is in a extremely traumatic situation or they're on the verge of death. So the last 10 years of my career, I spent working psych crisis in large hospital ERs, you know, throughout Tucson. And I found that the angelic spirits or the positive spirits would speak to um, these people when they were on the verge of suicide, um, or they would actually stop the suicide. You know, one that kind of sticks out in my mind was a lady who, she was extremely depressed. Her husband had left her. She didn't have any money. She was about to be evicted from her apartment. Um, she didn't have a job. She had a teenage kid. Everything was going wrong in her life, and she just went, okay, I'm done. I'm done. I've had it. I can't deal with this anymore. So she decided to um, kill herself. She didn't want to do it in her apartment where her son was. So she drove out to a railroad track in a small town uh, near here and waited for the train to come. So I guess she had the schedule, and she was waiting outside of those gates that come down to block the road from the train. She was on the phone with her um, daughter, I believe it was, in California, telling her goodbye. And when the train came, so she was had a bunch of alcohol. She took some pills. She was pretty well gorked out. When the train got close, she drove her car past that barrier into the middle of the train trap and stopped. And the train slammed into her. It picked up her car and threw it into the next track. Another train came by and hit it again. So here she's hit by two trains. It threw her car some like 50 yards off the road.
Come on.
And here she is sitting in her car, a crumpled mass of metal, like a crushed Coke can. She couldn't get out of it. Um, and they had to cut her out. When the rescuers got there, they had to cut her out. So she was probably there for some hours. And here she was sitting in front of me in the ER, and I'm doing a psych eval on her to see if she's safe to leave. And all she has is a black eye. And I'm like, what? You just got hit by two trains and all you got is a black eye? I'm like, unbelievable. It just, I'm like, does not compute, just does not compute. So I asked her, I said, what were you thinking when you came to after those trains hit you? She said, I was furious. She said, I was absolutely furious. I did not want to be here. I wanted to be dead. I did not want to come back. I wanted nothing to do with this place. And I said, well, what happened then? She said, well, after a while, she said, I felt this deep sense of peace. You know, um, it just flowed through her. And, it wasn't in words, but it was like in feelings, like everything is going to be fine. And she had this deep knowing that everything was going to be fine. They cut her out, and here she is sitting in front of me. And after talking to her, I didn't think she was suicidal any longer. But I didn't think psychiatry would go for that because we did the evaluations. Psychiatry would approve the release. So I submitted my report to the psychiatrist, and he let her out, which surprised me. you know. There was another guy, I remember he had a 357 Magnum with all the cylinders loaded. He put it to his head, it went click, put it, shot, pointed it at the floor, it went bang, put it to his head again, it went click, put it at the floor again, it went bang. And he goes, okay, I got it. And he stopped. Another guy went out way in the middle of nowhere to hang himself. I mean, just middle of nowhere. He had something under his foot, a stump or something. And he strung himself up to a tree limb, kicked the stump out from under him, and was hanging when a hunter came out of the woods, just out of nowhere, and came and cut him down. Another guy, he turned on the gas in his apartment. He passed out, and his sister, who only visited him like once a year, showed up and got him out of there.
More than a coincidence.
Yeah, more than a coincidence. I mean, time after time after time. And another guy who, decided to kill himself. He had a pistol. The voices told him, well, get in your car and just drive till you run out of gas, and then go out in the desert and shoot yourself wherever you run out of gas. So he did that. He ran out of gas. He took his pistol, went out to the desert, sat down on a rock, and he was getting ready to shoot himself when he said this strange bird appeared. He said he'd never seen a bird like that in his life, and it started screaming at him, just absolutely screaming at him. So he took the gun and he took a shot at it. And I asked him, did you hit it? And he goes, no. And he said, but the blast of the pistol woke me up. He said, I felt like I was under a hypnotic spell, and that the blast of the pistol woke me up. And I looked at the gun and I said, what were you going to do? Now that was very interesting, because a lot of these psychotics that I spoke to in the prison who were acting on what the voices said were also under a similar trance by the voices, and carried out these horrendous crimes. So these people that you see who are psychotic, and go in front of the judge and said, I didn't do this. I don't remember it. I don't remember anything about it. The voices told me to do it. And the judge goes, yeah, voices my butt, and locks them up anyway. It's like they put these people into a trance to get them to do these kind of things. It's very strange. So they were like, the further I went, there was like 23 of these patterns that the voices run. Okay. Now these are things, not like it's not like what psychiatry does. Well, they started out blaming schizophrenia on mothers. Oh, it's something the mother did. It's their fault. So when that fell through, then they started blaming it on what was the next thing they blamed it on? Genetics. So they moved it out of the province where people, the regular man, regular guy, could see for themselves whether there was any truth to what they were saying, into genetics. Now, when you get into genetics, you need a lab, you need trained people, you need, all this higher education and stuff to prove or disprove, what the accusation is. So they went for years and years going, oh, it's a genetic defect. It's a genetic, there's a genetic predisposition. They blamed it on genetics. They didn't have a cause. They didn't know what caused it. So they kept making up all this garbage and feeding it to the populace. So they have an excuse. So they look like experts. So oh yeah, we know the cause of it. We just, we're not able to cure it for some reason, but we know the cause. Bull, they don't know the cause. They never knew the cause. So they blamed it on genetics. So some geneticists eventually caught up with them and said, no, there's no evidence that there's a schizophrenia germ. No evidence. So they knocked that one out. So now they have no cause again. And to have a major disorder, the World Health Organization says it's among the top 10 illnesses on the planet. There's a massive number of people who suffer planet-wide from this stuff. So they knock off the genetic stuff. So then they come in with the chemical imbalance crap. And then when that was knocked off, they have nothing again. But they're still advertising, oh, it is believed that the chemical imbalance, to sell their they're toxic drugs, which don't cure anything. So, looking for something, I mean, these drugs didn't, all they did was sedated these people. You know, they didn't cure anything. Matter of fact, they were destroying their nervous systems, and the people, they wouldn't stay on them. They just wouldn't stay on them. So
these people, they're victims of a spiritual infection, and now they have to be subjected to these horrendous drugs from the pharmaceutical companies. Can you tell me about the dangers of invoking the voices? For example, somebody who has a Ouija board, for
oh,
example.
no, 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 don't mess with those things. They're very dangerous. They're very dangerous. I've seen a number of patients who um, uh, started with Ouija boards. You're evoking a diabolic realm. You never know what you're going to get through those things. You know, don't mess with them. Just don't play with them. They're very dangerous. Uh,
Can you talk about the energy drain again after an attack? Like when the schizophrenic goes through an attack, can you tell me about the energy drain that they feel afterwards?
yeah. So here's another piece of evidence that you could see for yourself if you're around the schizophrenic or you work with them. Now, for I would say probably 20 years, I believed that energy drain. I mean, the schizophrenics will report after the voices attacked them, their energy levels would drop to nothing. You know, and I thought for maybe 20 years that was due to the horrendously negative thoughts that the voices were putting in these people's brains. If you're sitting there and 24 hours a day, all your waking hours, these people, these voices are saying, you're no good, you're ugly, you're rotten, nobody likes you, they're faking like they like you, you're worthless, you're useless, why don't you just kill yourself? I mean, that kind of stuff over and over, just endlessly. Um, you could see where it would be kind of draining. And that's what I thought was happening. But there was a one-to-one correspondence between these voices attacking patients and their energy level being just depleted to nothing. I mean, you could see it. It's very clear. Talk to them, ask them, how'd you feel before the voices came? How'd you feel after the voices came? And I actually did a study on that, ran an analysis of variance on it once, and it was significant. There's a significant difference between their energy levels before and their energy levels after the voice is attacked. Okay? So I went, okay, what's going on here? And I thought it was just the negativity of the voices, but I was working in the prison at the time, and I came in one morning, and I was assigned. I usually got assigned the most. I was an adrenaline junkie, so I didn't much matter to me. I mean, it was like, yeah, okay, more fun and games. But I was assigned to do two different units, and one of them was the jail for the prison. So it was called the Central Detention Unit. It's where all the worst from all of the prison units would go. There was a maximum security unit. These guys were in a cell with a cellmate, locked down 24 hours a day. They were only given like 1 hour out in the sunlight a day. And I walk into my office, and here's a inmate letter from a prisoner who was in that central detention unit saying, my cellmate is crazy. He's walking around talking to something. He's out of it, and I woke up and a couple of times, and he's standing over me at 3 a.m, just staring at me in the dark. He said, I can't deal with this any longer. You have to do something about this guy. I'm losing my mind. Now, right on the tail of that comes uh, a note from the captain of that unit saying, hey, we need you to come over and look at this psychotic guy. All right. So I said, okay, I come up, take both of those things. I walk over there. And I looked up the information on the guy who wasn't psychotic in that cell. Right? And they were small cells. So, I mean, maybe 10 by 10 for 2 people in a sink, bunk beds, very small, very claustrophobic cells. And that guy was in there for protective custody, the guy who was sane. What he'd done is he snitched off one of the drug gangs, the Aryan Brotherhood, who was a fairly violent gang in the prison. And he told the staff about a drug deal. They caught the drugs, they confiscated the drugs, and they broke up the gang and sent them all over the state. So they were furious. The ones who were still there were furious. They wanted this guy dead. They'd already stabbed him twice. So they put this guy into the CDU for protective custody. So that's why he was there. I looked up the other guy, and he was psychotic as a bed bug. And apparently he wasn't on any meds at the time. So I went there, and they had a interview room up near the control tower of the cell block. And I called out the one guy who wasn't psychotic, hoping to get some extra information about his cellmate. And I watched as he came out of the cell, and he had plenty of energy. He walks up the stairs. He wasn't using the handrails. He kind of quickly walked over to the interview room, sat down. His thought was, and his speech was normal. There was normal rhythm to it. He was anxious, but he was coherent. He was, he had a normal amount of energy. So finished up with him and got a listing of the bizarre behaviors of his cellmate. Sent him back and brought up the second guy, the guy who was psychotic. And he was floridly psychotic. He was really out of it. And watched him. He struggled to get up the steps. He was using the handrails. He shuffled along the cell block walk, came down, sat into the office, and kind of slumped down into the chair. And then I started, asking him, what's going on? And he said he was hearing strong voices. He couldn't control them. They were 24 hours a day. He couldn't sleep. They were driving him crazy. He wasn't on any medications. And he was, just being crazy in the cell. He didn't have any energy. I asked him about it. He said he felt completely drained. So after I was finished with those two guys, I went, it's not, it's not the negativity. It's not what I thought it was. This was a perfect experimental situation. I mean, these two guys were in the same cell with the same guards, being fed the same food. Everything was the same. Everything was equalized. So you couldn't blame that loss of energy on anything else. They were being fed the same. They ate the same. They drank the same. Everything was equaled out. And after that interview, I went, okay, it's not the negativity of the voices that are causing this. So then I started asking other schizophrenic inmates that I was working with, what happens? What's your energy level before the voices attack? What is it after they attack? And I got a consistent loss of energy after the voices would attack these people. So I'm like, there's something odd here. They're not using it. And a lot of times they would report that they were just laying in their bed, tossing and turning all night. They weren't using a great amount of physical energy. They were just rolling around in their bed. And here they were reporting that they were as drained as if they were working out in the hot sun all day, digging ditches with a pickaxe, which didn't make any sense to me. So I started asking them, well, you didn't use that energy, right? No, I didn't use it. So I started suspecting that the voices were somehow taking it. And, at that time, I read a book called The Voice of Knowledge by a South American shaman by the name of Miguel Ruiz. So he was talking about these things, and he actually mentioned that they were energy parasites, that they fed off of human beings. And I went, that's interesting, because that's exactly what it appears I'm seeing. So I brought that book into the prison with me. And I always had a group of maybe 10, 15 schizophrenic inmates that I was working with, who I agreed to work with more intensely if they would tell me in real time what the voices were telling them when we were in session. And I found that fascinating. So there was one who I'd been working with. He was making pretty good progress. The voices were weakened. They were less and less. He was still hearing them. And I brought that book in with that paragraph underlined, and he came into the office. I closed the door. I said, "Hey, Mark, I'm going to read you this paragraph. I'd like you to tell me what you think about it," because I was always asking them questions about the voices. What do they do? How do they behave? How do they sound? What, every question I could think of, I would ask them, and what the voice. And then these patterns started emerging. So I went to read him. Now let me go back before I ever get to that point with the same guy. I started messing with these patterns. There's like 23 of them. So I'm like, what would happen if I started throwing monkey wrenches in these patterns? Then this fella and several others started coming in from this group I was working with, and they would say the voices are starting to really get pissed off with you. They don't like you messing with these things. They don't like what you're doing. And I'm like, well, tough crap, that's their problem. So I didn't pay a lot of attention to that. Then one guy comes in one day, and after I was done working with him, he stops in the doorway, and he turns around and he goes, "You know what you're doing is dangerous, don't you?" And I just looked at him. I like, it hadn't crossed my mind. It's just like, why would he say that? And I just stared at him, like didn't say anything. And he turns around and he walks away. I'm like, that's odd, because I'm thinking they're in their heads. They can't come out. They can't get me. They're stuck with them, you know. So I didn't pay much attention to it. Then the same guy comes back a few weeks later, and he knocks on my door without a pass. So I told them they could do that, if something, there was an emergency, and I would get, they could throw pebbles at my window. I'd get back to him as soon as I could. And he comes in and he says, the voices want to talk to you. And I'm like, what? Because that never happened before. In the like 20 years I've been working with schizophrenics, I've never had spoken directly to the voices. It was always I would say something to the patient would then say, the voices say this. So everything went through the patient. They were like the intermediary. I never talked directly to them. I wasn't even sure that you could. So I said, okay, come on in. He sits down and we close the door. I said, what do they have to say? And these words came out of his mouth. I'll never forget them. It was, you have no right to interfere with our way of life. And it's like, boom, it was like you're getting sucker punched or something. It was like, bam, like, whoa, I was in shock. I was like, and the prisoner was, he said, I didn't say that. He said, they said that. I didn't say that. And it would be dangerous to be playing games like that with somebody who worked in the prison psychologist. I mean, I had some degree of power over them, and it wouldn't be a good thing for them to mess with me that way. And he kept insisting, I didn't say that. That came from them. And I said, well, tell them this. And he said, they can hear it. They can hear it through my ears. They can hear it. And, then I said something about vision or something. And they said, they can see that too. They can see it through my eyes, and I'm like, whoa. So it was like, I was blown away. I closed the door and I canceled all my appointments for that day. And I'm like, what am I getting into here? you know, what is this? And there was nobody I could talk to about it. The only people who understood it were the schizophrenics themselves. I could talk to them about these things, but I couldn't talk to any of the other staff. I couldn't talk to my wife because it scared her half to death. I couldn't talk to anybody, because they go, well, you're a flaming lunatic. So I just kept it all to myself. But it was strange to get agreement from all these people who were schizophrenics who understood this stuff. So that didn't stop me. That wasn't enough to stop me. After I kind of recovered from that, then I got the book, what I was telling you about earlier from Miguel Ruiz, the shaman. And here was this section in it that was talking about these things being energetic entities. So I brought that in with me, and I called the guy in who told me the voices were dangerous, or might be dangerous. What I was doing was dangerous. So, he would tell me what his voices were saying. He was pretty reliable as far as that. And I started reading him that. I closed the door. I started reading him these sections about the voices being energetic parasites. And then I look up and I look at him, and he's in this daze. I mean, his eyes are like glazed over. He's in a daze. He's just sitting there stiff. And then behind my head, I hear this electrical crackling, like crack, crack. It sounded just like an arc welder, crack, crack, crack. And it moves toward the right-hand wall. And I look at him and I look at that, and I'm like, I'm thinking he's going to attack me. So I push my chair against the wall. So if he does attack me, he's not going to knock me over. I can at least kick back at him. And then I'm splitting my attention between looking at him and searching for something I could see with this crackling noise. And it's just crackling up the wall at a 45-degree angle, crack, 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 crackle. And I'm, back and forth, looking at him, looking at this thing. I don't see anything. I don't smell anything. I don't feel anything, but I'm hearing this, and it's lasting. I mean, it didn't quit. It just kept going. And I turned to him and I said, "Do you hear that?" And he just sat there. He didn't say anything. He's just staring at me with this glazed over stare. And I'm like, this is weird. This is really getting weird. And the crackling passes over up by the ceiling over his head, and then starts coming down the wall to my left. And here's this Rubbermaid trash can right next to my leg. And it jumps in that trash can, and it's crackling in the trash can.
Come
So
on.
I take a look at him to make sure he's not doing anything. And then I look down in that trash can and I see nothing. There's nothing there except this crackling. And then it stops. It just goes dead.
Was
And
it like electric or something? Some kind of like
that's what it sounded like. It sounded like an arc welder,
Mm.
and then it goes dead. It stops. And I'm like in shock, and I turn around and I look at him, and he slowly gets up and he goes, "I gotta leave." And he shuffles out of my office. And I'm like, yeah, get out of here. Go. Let go. Stay away from me. And he leaves, and I get up and I start inspecting the walls to see if there's any burn marks on them, because it sounded like electricity. I couldn't see anything, So I go out in the hall and I look at the other offices in the hall, but there's nobody in the doctor's office. There's nobody in the nurse's office. Nobody's there. Nobody's in that part of the building at all. I walk up and down the hall. There's nothing could account for that noise. And I'm in shock. I mean, I'm totally in shock. I didn't see anybody for the rest of the day. I just sat there staring out the window going, what the blazes just happened? What am I getting myself into here? So,
How did you cope with it? How long did it take you to readjust yourself to
well, I'll tell you, it took a while. It took me close to 3 months before I could call that guy back into my office, before I got the courage to call him back into my office. I didn't want to see him. I didn't want anything to do with him. I wanted to stay as far away from him as possible. After about 3 months, I called him back in. My curiosity got the best of me. He comes in, he sits down, he looks good. I was expecting after that he would be a wreck, because I stopped working with him also. I was like, I didn't want to see him at all, So he was doing pretty good at the time I last saw him, and he shows up and he looks good. I was expecting him to be a total wreck because I hadn't seen him in 3 months. He was out there on his own, fighting the voices on his own. I'd give him some tactics that he could use against them to kind of keep them down. Um, and I told him, hey, you look pretty good. I mean, I was expecting you to be a wreck. And he goes, no, I've been using what you taught me, and I've been able to keep them somewhat under control. And after some small talk, I asked him, I said, did you hear that crackling the last time you were in my office? And he goes, yeah, I did, but I was surprised that you did, meaning me, and I'm like, what was that? And he said, that was them. And I said, the voices? And he said, yeah, it was the voices. And I said, what were they doing? He said, they were trying to scare you off. And I said, they did a damn good job of it. And I said, you looked like a zombie when you were shuffling out of my office when you left. I said, what were you thinking? What thoughts were going through your head at that time? I said, what were the voices telling you? He said, they were telling me to go get a shank and stick it in your gut. A
Wow.
shank is like a homemade prison knife, that they sharpen on cement and make it into like a knife. And I was thinking, he wouldn't have done that. I worked with him for 6 months. He was one of my, he was one of my students who was doing the best. He wouldn't have done that. And I just asked him, I said, well, why didn't you do it? And he said, I couldn't find one and nobody would give me one. And I'm like, whoa, whoa. So yeah, that's
Well,
what these things are.
Jerry, what technique did you give him when he went away? You said that he came back and he was looking good and he was doing good. What help did you advise him to? What did you advise him to do?
Well, there's a number of things. One thing I found early on. Now, Sherry Sweeney, my co-author in the book, she turned this into a science. So I think it's in the book.
Mhm.
But we found out that these things consistently lie. They lie about everything. The voices. You can't trust them to tell the truth. You can't trust them to keep any bargain that they make with the patient. Uh, they're just outright liars and devious. They'll come through and they'll tell the patient that they are their guardian angels, that they're a protective spirit, that they have certain powers where they know what's going to happen. They can help them with this or that or whatever. Um, so they kind of come through to try to convince the patient that they can be a beneficial, like spirit to help them out. Once they get them to trust them, then they turn on them and they start doing rotten things to them. But once they're accepted, then they're in there. So one of the things that you have to teach schizophrenics is that you can't trust anything that these things say. They're consistent liars. And what they do is they can go into the patient's head and they can pull out every rotten thing they've ever done and put that thought in their head, which creates an awful lot of anxiety. So they want to create anxiety. They want to create fear. They want to create every negative emotion they can, because that's what they feed off of. They can't feed off of the higher frequencies, the higher emotions. So they will suck these patients dry. They're kind of like sharks that you put blood in the water. They can smell it from a mile away, and that negative emotional energy attracts them. So that they have to understand that these things are not hallucinations, like the psychiatric mafia tells them. That see, if you believe they're hallucinations, then there's nothing you can do about it. You're helpless. It knocks out any other course of action. Oh, hallucination, my brain is broken, I got a chemical imbalance. There's nothing I can do about that except take these toxic drugs expensive toxic drugs that are dished out by the psychiatric mafia and big pharma. It's like you know, uh, what is it? I forgot the name of it, but where there's a gate over hell, it says, "All who come here give up all hope."
Mhm.
All who
Dante's,
pass
Dante.
Dante's, yeah. All who enter here give up all hope. That's exactly what they're doing. Oh, there is no, it's a chemical imbalance. There's nothing you can do about it except see us, once a month, pay for our $100 office visit, and then $800, $900 a month for these toxic drugs that cure absolutely nothing. They don't stop the voices. They don't cure the voices. All they do is gork them out. They're basically major tranquilizers, you know, and they may weaken the voices, but they don't stop them. Yeah. And a lot of psychiatrists will tell them this is a life sentence. All you can do is take these drugs. That's bull crap. It's total bull crap. It's a lie. It's a devious lie.
In the book, you give a few techniques: stay away from negative people, stay away
Yep.
from drugs, stay clear,
Right.
or do at least one or two good things for yourself each day, listen to good
Right.
music, pleasant music. Can you tell us some more?
Well, the one is the realization that they are not hallucinations. Okay. They have to know that. They have to realize that. Hallucinations are random. These aren't hallucinations. And they already most of them already know that. you know. But here's the psychiatrist, the highly trained doctor telling them that they are, who has never questioned the voices, who has never spoken to them, who has never studied them, who has done no research on them whatsoever, telling these people this bold-faced lie and printing it in all the books, teaching it through all the universities, and brainwashing the whole medical system that these are hallucinations. They have to realize they're not, that these are entities that there's you can fight back against them. There are things that you can do to fight back against them. And you know, that has to be understood. If you believe they're hallucinations, there's nothing you can do about them. The second thing is, once you realize that they are not you, they don't come from you. They don't belong in your thought stream. Their intention is different from your intention. They're telling you to do things that you really don't want to do, that you know are not good to do, and yet you do them anyway because these things are so insistent. They are so uh, uh, repugnant, and just keep at it. They just keep hammering and hammering and hammering and hammering until the person gives in and does something that gets them in trouble. So these mass shooters that you see, a lot of them are psychotic, where the voices are telling them, yeah, just that's the thing to do. Just these people are evil. They got demons in them. You need to kill them. Stuff like that. Jeffrey Dahmer was one of them, who would tell the judge, "Oh, it's the voices that did this. I didn't do this. The voices did it." And the judge goes, "Yeah, my butt." You know, so they have to realize that these voices don't come from them. They are not their thoughts. They don't belong in their thought stream. So that's another thing they have to understand, is that we're taught from the time we're kids that all thought that appears in your mind belongs to you. That's not the truth. You get thoughts from all these other sources. You get thoughts from other beings, other etheric beings. Um, you get thoughts from angelic beings. You get thoughts from demonic beings. You're like a radio station. You're like a radio tuner. You know, if you went back, 300 years and to say Swedenborg, you brought a radio with you that could pick up the radio stations. You turn it on, and here's this human voice in there. They're thinking, well, how does a guy fit inside a box that small? You know, and it's talking. It's speaking English, and you turn to the dial, and it changes to different things. It changes to different messages, different stations. So you decide, hey, well, let's cut it open and see what this guy looks like. You cut it open, there's no man in there. Same thing with your brain. If you cut it open, you won't find a thought in there. Nobody's ever found a thought in a human brain. You know, nobody's ever extracted one. Yeah. So thoughts are energetic. The brain is like a tuner. It tunes to the frequency that you're tuned to, which has a lot to do with your upbringing and your experiences and the trauma you had. So people who have been badly traumatized in war, in physical, emotional, sexual abuse, they're tuned to a very low frequency for the most part. The world is awful, these kind of things. So they have to realize that those thoughts don't belong to them. That voice in their head doesn't belong to them. It's not who they are. It doesn't come from them. And that it's a consummate liar. You can't believe anything that it says. You can't trust any deal that it makes. I've had 3 patients that the voices told, if you gouge out your eye, we'll shut up and we'll leave you alone. We won't ever come back. 2 of them did it. Okay. And soon as they gouged out their eye, the voices reappeared. They went, you stupid fool. You listened to us. What a jerk you are. Now look what you did. You deformed yourself. Now you're a freak. You'll be a freak for the rest of your life. And they would laugh at him. That's the kind of entities you're dealing with the voices.
So in a sense, the only real remedy to this is to realize that in your book, you say we are spirit beings. So in a sense that if we realize we're spirit beings and we're dealing with a spiritual battle, I guess. I know you've got a diagram in the book and you show the light spectrum. And what we see is a very small percentage of what is actually going on in the world around us. So in a sense, the only way is to realize that we are spirit beings and we're dealing with spiritual dimensions that we can't control or understand or can't see.
Yeah. Now they can be pulled out too. They can be talked into the light, but you need to have spiritual help a lot of the cases to do that. They are what they're told. There's levels of them. Okay, so they have a supervisor. Many of them are assigned to destroy the schizophrenic. They're told that if you don't destroy this guy, we're going to send you to the pit. They're told they don't have any light in them, that if they don't succeed in destroying the person, that they will cease to exist. And they don't know any better. Some of them have never lived in a physical body. Some of them are earthbound entities. So there's a whole variety of different entities that can infest humans. Some of them are just dead human spirits that have taken up in there, like an aunt or a sister or somebody they know. I had one guy who, and I've carried on conversations with him a number of times. Most of them aren't. They're not very pleasant beings. But a lot of these are just earthbound entities that died and then didn't know what to do.
It's like in that book, Carl Wickland's book,
Yes.
30 years, what is it, 30 years among the dead? I
30
actually read
years
that.
among the dead. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
that was interesting because he would administer a static shock, which would drive these entities out. And then his wife, who was a psychic, would pick up and talk them into the light. So I found it very interesting after I read that these shock treatments that psychiatry uses will actually drive away the voices in a lot of cases for a few days before they come back. That was interesting with Wicklands. But yeah, you can talk them into the light. It is possible. You can have Archangel Michael take them and throw them out. They're nasty things to deal with, but the patient needs to know, have some weapons to fight back on his own. If they do not want to get rid of them, there's nothing you can do. There's nothing anybody can do.
Mhm, mhm. Well, it's been a great pleasure speaking with you, Jerry. And do you want to say anything else to anybody who's listening? Do you want to add anything to what we were talking about?
Yeah, just realize that what psychiatry is doing is just like a big merry-go-round. They're not curing anything, any mental illness with those drugs. There's there has emerged in the last and I'm using this myself. I've been trained in it. The MACE energetic method. It works with trauma
Can
like
you
nothing.
briefly explain that?
Explain the system.
No, the method. Yeah, but how you could implement that?
Well, it has to be implemented by a therapist. But
Okay.
what the concept is way different from any traditional therapy. It actually takes the spiritual, uh, it takes into account the spiritual being in the person. All right. And it helps, it does wonders with trauma. You know, it'll also remove the stuff that these voices feed off of. But it's a totally different concept than traditional psychotherapy, which I've found just doesn't work, you know, or works very poorly. But it views the mind totally different. And this was invented by John Mace. He's not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. He was a ship captain. He was a merchant marine, and he was a genius, and he read everything in philosophy and psychology. And I guess, well, on those long voyages, he would just read and read and read. He figured out that the mind isn't what we call the mind. He said the mind only takes pictures of where the attention is focused. That's all it does. Wherever you focus your attention, the mind will, it's basically a stimulus response mechanism. You focus your attention somewhere, it'll take a picture of that. But he also found that you can get rid of these pictures by energetically, because he found energy flows from negative to positive. Okay. So once he found that you can drain the energy out of these traumatic images, you know, there's a way to do it. And once that image is concentrated on and disappears, that trauma is no longer effective. You can still remember it, but it has no emotional charge. And this can be done very quickly, and it's permanent.
It kind of reminds me of NLP when you know make a picture black and white. I know there's a technique in NLP, something that kind of reminds me of that.
Well, it's got some similarities, but uh, I've never seen anything like it. You know,
Mm.
I've been using it probably for maybe 2 years now,
Well,
and
okay.
it provides permanent results.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I'll be looking that up. Sherry Sweeney also has a paper that's a live program.
that's a live
Um,
program. You can get that on my website, the whole write up to that.
mhm,
So, you know, you can go to my website at jerrymarzinsky.com.
mhm.
You can sign up for some May sessions. You can go to articles and pull up the That's a Live program. That should be used by every schizophrenic. Everybody hearing voices should be using that program, and we've got it on there completely free of charge. You know,
Fantastic,
put it
fantastic.
to use.
Mhm. And guys, I would recommend an amazing journey into the psychotic mind, breaking the spell of the ivory tower. That's the book. I'm going to have it in the description anyways. Jerry, once again, thank you so much. It's been great speaking to you. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.